So we are talking about this idea of our earthly vocations, and maybe this is overkill in some ways, but we're going to dig a little deeper today in some of the purpose behind it. Thus the title here, God's Special Purpose for Our Lives. It's a reaction or a counterbalance to the idea you got to go out and you got to find that one job that just fits you perfectly and is going to make you happy your whole life, that is going to make it so that when you go to the office, it's not like going to work, it's like you're on vacation every day. And good luck finding it. But some people, are on the constant search. The idea is that it's not just a job by which you make money, but your vocations cover all the different responsibilities you have in life, and that you see those as callings, that God himself has arranged your life to put you in those places, and that there is purpose and meaning and joy to be found in all of them. There's also heartache and a cross to be found in all of them, that is true. But bloom where you're planted. So, rank the following vocations in order of importance. Okay, so you don't have to rank all 9 there necessarily, 1 to 9, but to which ones you think would be a higher end, which one's a lower end. So farmer, pastor, police officer, janitor, accountant, teacher, politician, lawyer, cashier.
Politician and lawyer are tied for last.
Well, yeah, and normally politicians are lawyers. So a lot of times it's
Number 10, none of the above.
We got them back too.
Okay, so 7 and 8 today don't get a lot of respect. We have a lot of lawyer jokes. When I was at the seminary, and this is 35 years ago, we had various professionals that we might be interacting with in the community come in just to talk about what they do and where a pastor might have things that dovetail into their work. So we had some lawyers in, we had some more secular counselors come in. We had a number of people like that. And the lawyers began by telling lawyer jokes. So they recognize that they're not the most respected people. Now, that being said, number 2 there may not be all that respected, depending what people have in mind when they think of pastor, right? Is it, not to call out names, but if you have Pastor Joel Osteen or Pastor Benny Hinn, Pastor Kenneth Copeland. Now there's some people for whom they walk on water. Obviously, I just saw a thing this week where Joel Osteen and his congregation have paid off the $100 million that they had as a mortgage for the former Compaq Center in Houston, which was the former home of the Houston Rockets NBA basketball franchise before he bought the building and turned it into his church. So they just paid off $100 million. Well, obviously, in order for that to happen, he's got to be pretty popular out there. But for Christians who see through the smiley facade, I think he doesn't rank very high. And he is one who often gets called out by name with people who've got a more biblical view of things. And I subscribe to an email news list called Ministry Watch, where they're just kind of telling you what, who's gotten in trouble, where the scandal is, where the money's been misused, where the issues are in ministry across Christianity. And of course, I'm hoping I never show up on the website that they put together. But some of these kinds of guys show up there. So number 2, it depends a little bit on where you stand on the whole church thing as to whether you think that belongs in the top half.
Teacher.
What about it? Top?
I would put number 2, but anyway.
Okay.
The top 2 or 3.
Yeah, top end, not bottom ends.
Yeah.
And I think that when you take polls, so I forgot to print it out and bring it, but I had a set of polls that had looked at the 20 most respected positions and the 20 least respected positions. And teacher was close to the top. Well, we don't have to go through them all, but you get a sense that people have very different ideas. And what do you do with things that are almost minimum wage type jobs? Cashier, janitor.
Well, when you don't have a janitor,
and you don't have things clean and you have to do it, they're very important.
And
Yeah,
I think the cashier is more valuable than the janitor because then the farmer couldn't sell his crop to the people.
okay.
Well, I don't know, at the VA, they were partners, and, I mean, they
Yeah.
were partners with us, and, I mean, hospitals have their messes, and it's important to clean it up.
Absolutely.
And so they were a team member, and we trusted them, work with them. It was,
So I've never minded it personally, not on the janitor one, but on the cashier one. I've never minded it personally when you have self-checkout at Walmart or someplace. So when I first came to Oklahoma, we were buying something at Walmart, and eventually we knew this lady by face, and we usually would avoid her line. And nothing against, she was very friendly. She was extremely friendly, but we did not need the color commentary on everything we bought coming down the line before it went to the end to go into the bag. So,
We'd go, no, go.
yeah, not always.
The guy we
But a lot of people have now complained about the fact that you have the self-check. And that they've taken those jobs away, and they would rather have the cashier. And they complain about, well, Walmart doesn't employ me, so why should I have to do this job for them to check out my own groceries?
Well, it turns out that's not working for them very well.
So I know that some stores have begun to backtrack on that somewhat and to add more cashiers back in.
we always go to the cashier because we're offended by the idea that they're
Taking jobs away.
taking jobs away.
Not him.
Not me.
It makes the experience so much more
Get
pleasant.
out of here.
Why would we take away our pleasant experience of shopping?
It's not
Maybe we
always
could just
pleasant.
go to the cashier. Well, it's not always pleasant, but most of the time it
Most
is.
of the time it is.
Well, anyway, so people have different opinions about how highly it ranks. But the point is, of course, as we talk about vocation, that before God, they all have value, meaning, and purpose. But whether your job is low paid or high paid, whether it requires a lot of training or very little training, whether it has high prestige or low prestige, it is a way by which you legitimately serve your neighbor. And that all by itself means that it has purpose from God. It is a calling. And what if we saw more of our lives that way? Regarding my own, when I had the call to the seminary about a year before I came here, the great thing about the call, John, is that you never make a wrong choice. That was he's president of Martin Luther College now at the time, Professor Richard Gergel at the seminary. But the idea that, again, because God calls and God puts you in places, and that no matter where you wind up on your deliberation of that call, whether you're going to serve in this place or that place, you have been placed there by God to love and serve your neighbor. And so his idea wasn't that somehow you had to channel God in order to find out which one of these you had to take. The idea was also with the call to divine ministry. Once you're presented with the two choices, you have real choices. And what God's concerned about is that you love and serve his people in either direction. And that concept is a huge relief, really, rather than to agonize about somehow I have to wait for this vision from heaven that tells me exactly where I have to be. Now, there have been times in Bible history where God did that with certain people, where it was Moses, Jonah, we talked about them earlier. They didn't have a whole lot of choice, right? It was going to be, you're going to do this or you're going to do this. There's not an option here, right? And you will like it. But for the call with the ministry, other than my first call, which was an assignment out of the seminary, I can do this or I can do this, and I can serve God's people either way. Or Professor Daniel Deutschlander's way of describing the same. With the Lord, every day is Christmas. Which is kind of way he would say to the students, you're going to be out there, and you may be not thinking of it this way, but it is a gift that you get to serve this person, and you get to serve this person, and you're just opening up these packages all day long. It's like you're sitting around the Christmas tree, and I get to do this for people. I get to do this for people, right? With the Lord, every day is Christmas. because God deals with us purely on the basis of grace, and it's just grace upon grace, every day, all day long. With the Lord, every day is Christmas. In other words, our seminary students achieved a failure. He was talking about those who were second career people who. Well, we watched the Dave Rosenau thing, right? He had been a undertaker, and then he became a undercover cop, and then he decided to go into the ministry. A lot of people had encouraged him that he had the gifts for it. And in many church bodies, those kinds of folk actually make up the majority of those at the seminary. So people who are second career. And while former Pastor Bird was teaching at the seminary, he had conversations with them, and a lot of them felt like, well, I had my old job, and it didn't seem like I was really serving God there. But now I'm going to go into the ministry, and now I'm going to be, I'll have something that's meaningful and purposeful, and I'll be serving God. And they said over time, sometime, hopefully while they were still at the SEM, as they did their studies and found out it's not all fun, and hopefully early in the ministry, otherwise, they learn as they interact with their lay people now, that you all serve God. And you serve God in what you were doing before. It's not that you made a bad choice necessarily by going into the ministry, but it's not like you are serving God better. This is one of the insights that Martin Luther brought back to the attention of the church at the time of the Reformation. That at the time, they thought that to go be a monk or a priest, that was a higher calling than to be a serf, a peasant, even a ruler. And Luther said, no, the housefrau who is changing her baby's diapers, the bower, the farmer who is out pitching manure on the field, is serving God and serving his neighbor just as much, and maybe often more, than the bishop or the monks, who sometimes have turned their church calling into self-service in many cases, and especially then, it was a way to flee the world. And not everything was peachy keen in the monasteries. It's not that they didn't do anything for us. There was good things that came out of the monasteries too, but it wasn't purely all good, not nearly. And Luther saw that up close because he became a monk for a while. And it's not that he left the church, the service of the church when he came to his realizations on this, but he recognized that whatever you're doing, you are doing to serve God. So in other words, our seminary students achieved a failure. They failed to find fulfillment in what they thought would be the ideal vocation for them, the perfect job, the fairy tale career. At least in terms of just satisfying something in themselves when it comes to fulfillment. There's fulfillment to be found in being the cashier, if you understand what you're doing. There's fulfillment to do in whatever you're doing right now. There's fulfillment to be found in the ministry. But that is largely from the outside from God, not because it just makes me happy. It was a fine thing for me to serve as HOA president. Right now I am feeling happy that I am no longer HOA president. But there was fulfillment to find in that also, and purpose and meaning, that I serve my neighbor that way. Now somebody else can serve my neighbor that way. What does God care about in our careers? So what's God looking for? Why did he stick you where you are? What is God looking for? Matthew 6:33. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. What does that tell us about what God's looking for?
Maybe there's another passage that might be helpful. Whatever you eat or drink,
What's that? Say it louder, Aaron.
whatever you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God.
Okay. So in whatever we're doing, his purpose for us is that we seek his kingdom first. Right? Seek his kingdom first. And then recognize that everything else he's going to take care of. But God, wherever he's placing you, he wants that to be prime in your life. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. When he begins chapter 7, he is speaking especially regarding marriage. The congregation in Corinth had a lot of questions about, is it better to marry or not marry? How long do your marriages have to last, or should they last? They had a bunch of questions. So the whole chapter is dedicated to that. But as he gets on in the chapter, he broadens the discussion out to just more generally your place in life in many ways. So he says, nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. Now, he's not saying you can never change, right? He's not saying you couldn't get married if you were single. He's not saying that you can't change jobs. But he's saying in terms of your relationship with God, be content with what you're at. You know, if you feel personally like you can serve in a different way, or you have a desire to, that's fine. But you're not doing a more godly thing by doing so. So be content there. Retain the place in life in which the Lord assigned you. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man, so he gives some examples in various different directions. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commandments is what counts. So, this was a big battle and discussion they had in the early church about whether the old Jewish practice of circumcision was necessary, especially as they worked among the Gentiles. And he's saying to the Gentiles, you were born a Gentile. Jesus doesn't care anymore. You don't have to try to pretend you're a Jew. It's not a higher or holier place. They occupied a place in God's plan in a specific way in the past. But now God's calling you. So you don't have to try to switch back and forth here. And if you're a Jew and you recognize that the Jews are kind of rejecting God and it's going to the Gentiles, I don't know that anybody's ever explained how you become uncircumcised, but, if you are, well, anyway. So, nor am I going to attempt to here. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each one should remain in the situation in which he was in when God called him. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. So sometimes people accuse the New Testament or the Bible in general of being in favor of slavery. It wasn't in favor of slavery. It did recognize that slavery was a thing and that Christians were not in a position, or the Jewish nation before that was not in a position to overturn that and get rid of it altogether. And if you read the Apostle Paul's letter to Philemon, he makes it pretty clear that he would like him to set a slave free. And here he says, if you are a slave, if you can get your freedom, do so. But don't let it trouble you. You don't have to run away. You don't have to try to force it. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freed man. So God considers you the same. Similarly, he who was a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. The terminology we even have in our English translations you may have heard before. We sometimes talk about servant, and in some places slave. They don't line up with how we define those terms in our heads so much. Okay, the servant in the New Testament was not the English butler, okay, or the maid. Right? Different thing. And the word for it often was something that might include an indenturedness or a loss of one's will to do what they want. Okay, and the slave was not just the manual labor on a plantation of some sort, or somebody who's got to work hard and work themselves to death. Right? In the Roman system, when they went and conquered a country, they tended to take as slaves the doctors and the teachers and the people we might think are up high. And they would often set them up in business. And then they would take the money off of the guy. They got this Greek doctor who's a genius, and they're getting money off of it. And then sometimes they would let those guys buy their way out of slavery eventually, or they'd let them have some of their own customers where they got to keep some of the pay. They weren't free to just go, but it was a very different thing. And because it was so widespread in ancient culture, even people in slavery didn't always see it as the worst option. So the experience was different. It wasn't that the scriptures supported it as such, and you get a clue of that here. It's that they recognized they weren't going to overthrow it anytime soon. And so it's the world order in which you live. You have to deal with that. So as you're going to deal with that, how are you going to do that? You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. So he's saying, don't sign up for it. Brothers, each man is responsible to God should remain in the situation God called him to. That's the third time that's been stated here in these short set of verses. So you can switch jobs if you like, but don't be desperate to get there. Serve God well and your neighbor well where you're at right now. And that's fine. It's a good thing. You can work to improve your lot. That's okay as well. So what does God care about in our careers? Well, again, so you're seeking his kingdom first. That's your first concern, not your earthly circumstances, but you seek his kingdom first in your life. And then secondly here, that as whatever your position you're in, that you have a degree of contentedness about it, and that you are looking to serve him and your neighbor wherever that might be. So a conclusion about our purpose, quotes here. Well, we were created for communion with God. We won't fill the void, find our purpose in our job, marriage, race, sex, culture, heritage, hobbies, ministry, or accomplishments any more than we do in our things. But we recognize this more clearly, I think, and it gets preached about more in church, that the brand new car is not going to fill the hole in your heart. The 3,000 square foot house, or the 2,000 square foot house, or the house, is not going to fill the hole in your heart. The $1 million 401k that is going to allow you to have a retirement in which you get to travel and really enjoy life, it's not going to fill the hole in your heart, right? Those things don't do that. And finding the perfect job isn't going to either. And changing the other circumstances in your life, these other callings, isn't either. Learn to use all those things as tools to serve God and each other. That's where it goes. In our Father's house, he says, we discover the freedom to love those around us, whether they be family, friends, neighbors, strangers, or even enemies. Maybe you're in a vocation in which the big opportunity is to love your enemy. Did you ever think about it that way? God has called you to this place because you have enemies there and you can show them his love. A lot of times if we have too many enemies there, then we think, well, we need to bail. We need to get out. Maybe you are there just to love them too. What if Jesus came and said, too many enemies around here? But it was just the opportunity to serve the way he was supposed to, right? Okay. Last section, altars as locations of love. What does 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10 teach us about the status of every Christian before God? But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received a mercy, but now you have received mercy.
Well, we're special.
Yeah. So all the language of this passage, especially the list, comes out of the Old Testament. When Israel was at Mount Sinai, there God told the people through Moses that they were a chosen people, that he regarded them as a kingdom of priests, as a people, as a nation. And they all had that special relationship with God as his chosen people. So what Peter is passing along to New Testament Christians is, you don't have to be Jewish for this to be true of you. But that's true of you also. But when you look at some of the things there, especially priesthood in the list, you recognize that, well, and royalty also, I suppose, right? That those things imply service. We often think of royalty just as a means for living a luxuriant lifestyle. But historically, that was a way a person served. And a priest was a way that people served God. And he's saying, every one of you is a Christian. And so there's a reason you don't call me Father Viets. Why do you not call me Father Vietz? Aaron calls me Dad, otherwise, not so much.
We're all supposed to be in service to each other.
Okay, how many priests does Grace Lutheran Church have? Well, maybe not the exact figure. It's about 50, 55?
51.
51? Is that what the latest statistics?
Preachers spoke.
Yeah, okay. Right, we have one pastor,
Preachers speaking.
but we have over 50 priests. This is the passage that Martin Luther used to lay out his teaching of the universal priesthood of all believers. Okay. It doesn't mean everybody is in the called, ordained ministry. That's a different thing. But that every believer before God is a priest who's been called by God to serve him on behalf of their neighbor. And that comes out of 1 Peter 2 in particular. So, not necessarily called ministry like that, right? In the Old Testament, you had the high priest, upper left-hand corner there of the screen. Today, we've got those who would serve in a priesthood, but you too. We all serve as priests.
I get used to it. I can tell.
Where do we serve in our priesthoods? Romans 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. So what do priests do? Say it.
Spread the good news.
Well, they would do some of that. Well, in the Old Testament, what was the main job of a priest?
Sacrifice.
Offer sacrifices. And so what does Paul say? He doesn't use the word priest here in this passage, but it's the same thing when you look at the duty, right? I urge you, brother. He's talking to the whole congregation in Rome. In view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. That's a priestly thing. The picture I have there is Abraham getting ready to sacrifice his son Isaac. We're not talking about a blood sacrifice. There may be cases where it gets to that point, but we're talking about a living sacrifice, that the offering you're giving up is the time, ability, all of those things. And if you read on in Romans chapter 12, then he lays out the various gifts, at least a selection of them that people might have for this kind of service. And he goes all kinds of places. He does some things that are more what we might traditionally think as ministry gifts in the church, the teaching and preaching kind of things. But then he talks about administrative kinds of gifts, and that is also a part of offering your body as living sacrifices. So your officers of the congregation, whether men's groups or ladies groups, etc., right? And then he talks about things that we might not even always think about in this regard. People whose gift is encouraging other people. People whose gift is, whether they have a lot of money or not, they just see a need and they give to it. They're just the kind of person who just put it in for somebody else. You know, so they're quick to give their money away, and that's a spiritual gift. He says it's a living sacrifice way of living before God. It is a part of your spiritual priesthood as a Christian. So, do our living sacrifices take place at church or in the world?
In the world.
Only? What's the answer to this question?
Yes.
Yes, right? Yeah. And so yes. I mean, but you're correct. The one we tend to forget about is the world side of it. But the fact is, it's both and, not either or, right? We can't only have you out there in the world doing things and offering nothing here. Then the body doesn't function properly either, right? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So as I said before, the homemaker who's washing dishes and changing diapers, the farmer who has fairly humble work to do, working with the animals and getting kind of dirty and grimy through the day. Also, right? The lowliest things that you do at home, taking out the trash, do it all to the glory of God. It's a part of your calling, and you serve others that way. Wherever you are active in love for another, there is your altar of vocation. That's back to the idea of the title of the chapter about my altar has a diesel engine. So driving a petroleum truck out in the panhandle of West Texas, this was his opportunity to serve his neighbor, serve the company, serve the customers, served all the people who bought that oil in whatever form it ended up in, at gas stations and turning into plastics or whatever it became. All of that was purposeful and meaningful, just as his job as a pastor had been, just as his teaching at the seminary had been.
It was safe. He had to drive it safely. He had to drive it reliably.
Yes, yeah, serving people on the road by not running them off the road, right? All of those things.
Yeah, and he had to be reliable. If somebody said, go pick up something from
Yep.
these tanks, and, he couldn't stop off and get donuts all morning and not be there, so.
So list some of your altars as Christian priests.
My apps, the
Okay.
computer apps, something that shows, okay, this person's lab test came back with this result, which is positive or negative for something that they really don't want to have, and making sure that it is in fact correct.
Okay. So some of us have altars that were built by Apple or Dell, right? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I offer things on those. Yeah.
It is the place at which you do that
Okay.
work and you serve.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, he had an altar that was built by what Peter built.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, as a programmer, I really don't like Microsoft, which not a surprise to some people, but it did provide us a generic solution that was available to people who were not programmers across the board, so that if they had 100 different operating systems on PCs, then they wouldn't have gotten the service that they got when he took over the market. So
Microsoft tried to make sense out of the chaos.
yeah, and they, to the extent that humans could.
Apple just decided they weren't going to allow the chaos.
Apple did a better job, but we probably should hate them just as well. But in fact, we hate Bill Bet worse. So anyway, okay.
All right.
But it was it was a.
All right.
It was a service to
The
me.
point is, both of them provided
Yeah.
people an opportunity to serve their neighbor.
Right.
And thus we're building, so to speak, altars for the universal
Right.
priesthood of God's people as they go out and serve in the world, right? So,
Right.
Homemaker, it could be a stove.
okay, yeah. Maybe your altar was built by Frigidaire or Whirlpool or Amana.
I like the one built by Schwinn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Schwinn or yeah. But one of the things with serving as a parent, right? I mean, you've got altars that are horses, right? Okay. Horse trailers? Still have them, right? That hasn't changed. Still riding? Yeah. You guys used to have those. Bob, yours used to be concrete trucks, right? Cement mixers?
Bridges.
All right, bridges and overpasses and that kind of thing?
Pretty important.
Yeah,
Pretty big.
yeah.
We
Don't want
had 50 or 100 years for a good bridge over the Mississippi.
yeah. You don't want to end up like that one in Minneapolis a few years ago, right? Pizza ovens?
I was trying to think of that too.
So I've just got a selection of various ones up there, right? But you find them at home. You find them in places that employed you. Keep your eyes open. As we think about this now, just keep your eyes open for other things that may not occur to you. Might be a little writing desk at home where thank you cards get written or encouragement cards get written. That's your altar. And your sewing machine, okay? Yeah, okay. So might be your smartphone at times. Depends what you're talking about. Overheard at a dinner for the annual meeting of the Texas Association of Accredited Private Schools. Let me give you a little background. So, for years, Lutheran schools were just this institution to themselves, The Wisconsin Synod runs the fourth largest private school system in the United States, behind the Roman Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So we run the fourth largest private school system in the United States.
Wells?
Yeah, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. And we have our own teacher training college. We've got our own systems in place. It was kind of self-sufficient. But over time, there became more and more demand for it to be recognized outside because, well, like in Dallas where we were, the public school started to make our 8th graders test in. And they blew the tests away. I mean, it was a little bit
Insulting?
insulting because we knew that our students were, we knew how the scores of our students compared to the average scores of their students compared, and they should have been coming to us for advice, not the other way around. I mean, it wasn't even close. You know, our students scored 20 to 30 points ahead of the schools that were making our students test in. But we don't run the government. So they were protecting, you know, the integrity of the education in their schools, right? No, you should have been just thanking us for letting our students go into your schools and lifting the level, frankly. But so we went to get accredited, and the accreditation corporation that we contacted was the Texas Association of Accredited Private Schools. So we had to go through the whole process and do a self-study, and they came in and observed, and you know, they gave high marks. But there was an annual association meeting, and 2 of the people who were on the visitation team that looked at our school, after interviewing our teachers, was overheard saying this at the annual dinner. They, and that's the teaching staff at Calvary Lutheran School, all believe that they've been called by God.
They have been.
Well, they have been, yes. But that idea that these teachers saw what they were doing as being called by God, you know, the old Blues Brothers movie, you know, we're on a mission from God, right? We're on a mission from God. But that was striking to them, that it wasn't just a job. It wasn't just someplace they were going and putting their time in and getting work done. It wasn't even just a special thing that they thought they were doing, but they thought of themselves as being called by God. And that was not typical.
How did the association guys mean that? I mean, they could have meant it in a lot of different ways, like, they all believe in the call by God.
It was seen in a complimentary way.
In a complimentary way.
Yeah. They saw that as, they were impressed by it.
Okay.
It's not that they didn't have other schools they were impressed with, but they thought
Right.
the fact that every faculty member
They were
thought
dedicated.
that way.
They were dedicated. They were
And it wasn't just dedication even, but the
Right.
idea of called by God. It's like,
right. Yeah.
Anyway,
When I took the MMPI, there was you're supposed to answer true false, and it said, I am a special agent of God. Well, I had to think about that for a long time, and I decided to answer it in a way that would get me passed on the test and not sent somewhere.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So why do I put that up there? You have all been called by God. You don't have to be teaching in a Christian school for this to be the case. Whatever you're doing, you've been called by God. You should think about it that way. It brings a level of dignity to the work you do at all times.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I worked at the agency in Oklahoma that was in charge of Medicaid, and mostly it was reimbursing doctors and things for services and things. But and so it was working with people who were indigent, who were, you know, and a lot of the people, there were 200 people there, and I think a lot of them felt that they were called by God to serve the poor, to serve the doctors that were serving poor.
So it's not as though it doesn't exist anywhere. But again, learning in our study here to apply it to all the various hats that we wear. How might or should such a belief, well, okay, the way we affect our work, that's the point I was just making. What if we believe that about all of our vocation? Well, so what would be the impact of thinking this way?
Improve work ethic.
Should. right? It should improve your work ethic.
Productivity.
It ought to improve your mood about the work you do, and give you maybe a little spring in your step as you're going to work. Here I am going to serve God and serve my neighbor again today. It ought to elevate all of that if we regard it in such a direction. Luther's summary of our Christian callings from the freedom of a Christian. A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. So we have emphasized a little bit of that along the way here also, right? That there's a certain freedom that comes to us, that he doesn't force you into these things. But a Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. And that applies at all times. So how do these apparently contradictory statements find their resolution in the gospel?
I don't know what the first one means.
A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none.
I mean, God doesn't force you.
Mm-hmm.
God doesn't take your arm and hold it behind your back and threaten to break it if you don't do your job or, go to church or whatever.
Okay.
You have choices.
We aren't following anyone except God. So
Who is your only Lord and Savior?
Jesus.
And nobody else has that position and can take that away from you. And you are free. Now, does he expect you to obey the government and love to your neighbor? So it's not as though it's either or here, right? The whole concept here, it's both and. It's both and.
I mean, in the 16th, in the period here, his time Luther lived, there were still lots of people who were bound to their feudal lord.
Oh yeah, there was more levels of society and class in his time. We've kind of flattened that all. We're much more egalitarian. They were not nearly that at all in his time. But his way of describing it to the Christian is that you go about, it's you and God. But now understand that God would have you out there in the world serving as Jesus did, and so you place yourself at everybody's disposal. It's a paradoxical statement, right? Part of the idea of being a perfectly free Lord of all is that as a Christian, everything serves you. So we think of us obeying the government, but the fact is the government serves us. We talk about public service, right? And anybody who doesn't go into government work thinking in terms of service is not qualified. They disqualify themselves on the face of it by not being willing to serve in that position. They are there to serve other people, not to just get other people. You know that at work, as you get into the higher levels of authority in a company, those who don't think of their position as an opportunity to serve probably ought not to be in those positions. So, but in the gospel, is where we find these things coming together, because Jesus died to set us free from our sins, but in setting us free from our sins, he also set us free from our sinful nature, and thus set free to serve everybody. So I don't serve the government because I have to. I serve the government because God has set me free from myself to love my neighbor this way. Think about it. All right.
So God is the ultimate, is our ultimate personal master, person we serve, and everyone, but so he comes above everyone else,
Absolutely.
even our feudal lord.
Absolutely.
So,
We must obey God rather than men. That was the apostles laid that down as a principle in Acts when they were being confronted for preaching the gospel. Right? Let the Sanhedrin rage all they want, and they might be the masters and leaders, but we must serve God rather than men. We're wrapping it up here, so I want to finish these last slides. So then, no more boasting about men. All things are yours. Whether Paul or Apollos or Stephen, Paul was the leader of the congregation, and so was Apollos, or the world, or life, or death, or the present, or the future. All are yours, and you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. So there's that top one. To him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood, not made us slaves, and has made us to be a kingdom and priest to serve his God and Father. Well, there's the other side of it. To him be glory and power forever and ever. So we live both in a freedom and we live in service to God as those universal priests again. In a world where the sacred is sequestered to certain times and places, Christ turns things upside down by permeating our lives with holy things, holy times, and holy duties. And then the concluding, blessed are those who fail to find their calling at least in the sense that they're going to find that one thing that fills that hole. For theirs is the kingdom where life and love and service find them.